The night of the Whitmore ball, Georgiana stood at the edge of the candle-lit room with nowhere further to retreat, and Lady Dorothea Ashmore's voice carried across a gathering of 200 people as though it had been designed to carry precisely that distance. "The companion," the dowager said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, "appears to have mistaken an invitation extended to the household for one extended to herself." 200 faces turned. The music did not stop. But the nearest couples slowed, their feet forgetting the figure, as their eyes found Georgiana in her gray silk. Plain-hemmed, retrimmed twice in the past season alone, standing at the entrance of the Whitmore ballroom like a woman who had just understood the nature of the trap she had walked into. What happened next? She could not have predicted. She could not have predicted it because nothing in the preceding 10 weeks of her life at Ashmore House had taught her that such a thing was possible. She had arrived there in early spring, expecting nothing, and the house had confirmed her expectation at every turn, and so she had lowered her gaze to the middle distance and prepared to endure, which was the posture she had learned to carry since her father's death. She had not planned to be seen. She had not planned, most certainly, for the Duke of Ashmore to cross that room. Georgiana Stuart came to Ashmore House on the 3rd day of April in 1814, 23 years old, the daughter of a clergyman who had left her nothing but a careful education and a grief she had not yet found a way to set down. The position had been arranged through Mr. Calloway, the ducal solicitor, who had written with a precision that left no ambiguity about the nature of the post. Companion and reader to Master Oliver Ashmore, age 7, ward of the Duke, orphaned 11 months prior, presently disinclined to speak at length or at all. The salary was to be £30 per quarter. Her accommodation would be the East Wing's 3rd room. She was to take her meals in the schoolroom unless the Duke specifically directed otherwise, which Mr. Calloway's letter implied he would not. She had accepted without hesitation because £30 per quarter was the difference between staying and not staying in any room at all. The carriage that delivered her to the house deposited her in a courtyard where the gravel was pale and perfectly raked, and where a footman stood waiting with the expression of a man who had been instructed to show the new companion to her room without unnecessary conversation. Ashmore House itself was a great stone structure with tall windows and a façade that had been designed, like the Duke himself, for authority rather than welcome. Rooks called from the elms at the property's eastern edge. A thin wind moved across the open courtyard and found the gap between Georgiana's collar and her neck, and she stood for a moment with her single trunk at her feet, and looked up at the windows and told herself, quietly, that this was sufficient. Sufficient was what she had. Oliver was 7 years old, and he had his uncle's gray eyes and his late father's narrow shoulders. And when Georgiana was brought to the schoolroom to meet him, he was sitting at a table with a book open before him that he was not reading. He looked at her without expression. She sat down across from him without ceremony and said, "I am told you have already read all of the natural history volumes. I would like to know which one you found most wanting." He looked at her for a long moment. He did not answer. She took off her gloves and laid them on the table and waited. And presently he pointed to the volume on marine creatures. And she nodded and said she had always suspected the illustrator of making things up entirely. And something in his face shifted, very slightly, in a direction that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. That was their beginning. The dowager received her in the drawing room on the same afternoon, while Oliver had his lesson with the house tutor. Lady Dorothea Ashmore was a woman of 61 years who wore her white hair dressed high and her silk the color of pewter, and her posture in her carved chair was the posture of a woman who had never once doubted that the room around her had been arranged for her comfort. She looked at Georgiana with the steady appraisal of someone examining goods delivered to the wrong address. "A clergyman's daughter," she said. "From Devonshire." "Yes, my lady." "And your father has been gone how long?" 14 months, my lady." "Long enough that you have no resources remaining," the dowager said, as though completing an equation rather than addressing a person. "You will find Ashmore House operates on particular principles. The Duke does not entertain disorder. The staff do not gossip. And the East Wing," here she paused to let the geography do its work, "is east of the family wing for a reason. Oliver requires quiet, regular occupation, and the suppression of any tendency toward excessive sentiment. He is, after all, a future gentleman. You will kindly bear that in mind." "I will, my lady," Georgiana said. "A servant," the dowager said almost to herself, adjusting the angle of her fan, "who remembers she is a servant is worth considerably more than one who does not." She was dismissed with a nod toward the door. She did not cry. She had learned, over the preceding 14 months, that crying in front of people who had decided what she was achieved nothing and cost a great deal. And so she carried the dowager's assessment back to her room in the East Wing and set it beside the other assessments she had been given since her father died, and she unpacked her trunk with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned not to expect the contents to stay long. The Duke she did not meet for 3 days. When she did meet him, it was in the corridor outside the library at 8:15 in the morning, when she was carrying Oliver's borrowed book on the natural history of birds, and he was moving through the corridor with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been required to move around anyone. He stopped. He was 31 years old, and carried those years the way the house carried its stone, as something settled and weight-bearing. His face, Georgiana thought, had the quality of a winter sky before weather. Not cold exactly, but committed to a temperature. He looked at the book in her arms, then at her. "Miss Stewart," he said. She had not expected him to know her name. She answered, "Your Grace," and stood aside to give him the corridor. He did not move immediately. His eyes went to the book again. "He asked for the Birds volume," he said. It was not a question. "He pointed to it," she said. "He has not asked in words, but I believe the pointing serves." Something happened in his face that she could not precisely name. It was not warmth, or not only warmth, but a quality of attention that was different from the dowager's appraisal. Where the dowager had looked at her and seen category, he seemed briefly to be looking at her and seeing something else entirely. He said nothing further. He walked on. She stood in the corridor with the Birds volume pressed to her chest and her heart doing something immoderate, and she told herself it was merely the surprise of being addressed, which was a reasonable explanation, and one she intended to believe. 3 weeks passed. Georgiana settled into the house's rhythms the way a river settles into a new channel, following the path of least resistance through each day and occupying as little space as possible. She took breakfast in the schoolroom. She read to Oliver in the afternoons, first from the natural histories, then from travel accounts, then, at his pointed request, from a volume of stories she had brought from her own trunk, worn at the spine and soft at the corners, from being read many times before. Oliver listened with his chin on his folded arms and his gray eyes steady, and he began, by the second week, to ask her questions. Single words at first, then short phrases. Then, one afternoon in the garden at the end of April, a full sentence about whether the man in the story was afraid. "I think he was," she told him. But he kept going anyway. That is what courage looks like sometimes. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going in spite of it. Oliver considered this with the solemnity of a 7-year-old processing a truth that has just arrived earlier than expected. "My father kept going," he said, before he didn't. She heard the weight of it, and she did not look away from it or redirect him towards something lighter. She said, "Yes, I think he did." She waited, because the garden was quiet and there was nowhere to be, and Oliver did not need to be managed toward feeling less. Neither of them heard the step on the gravel path that stopped 15 feet away, behind the stone balustrade where the climbing rose had just come into its first uncertain leaf. If Edmund had intended to pass through the garden on his way to the stables, he did not do so. He stood at the balustrade for longer than he had stood still in any place in recent memory, and what he saw, when he permitted himself to see it clearly, was a woman in a plain brown dress sitting beside his ward, with her hands folded and her face turned toward the boy as though nothing in the world was more worth attending to. She did not hurry Oliver. She did not fill his silence with easier words. She held the quiet with him, as though she understood that some silences are not problems to be solved, but territories to be witnessed. He had not watched anyone be present with Oliver like that since the boy's father had been alive. The knowledge of it moved through him in a way he had no language for and no permission to have. He walked onto the stables without announcing himself, which was a choice, and one that cost him something he did not name. If you have ever felt the particular pull of a story that already knows where it is going, you are in the right place. Stay with us. The ball at Ashmore House was the first of the season, on the last Friday of May, and Georgiana had not expected to attend it. She had, in fact, been planning a quiet evening in the schoolroom with Oliver and the Birds volume when the Duke's instruction arrived via the footman. All household members were expected to be present for the opening of the evening, after which she might retire at her discretion. She understood this to mean that her presence was architectural rather than social, part of the house's presentation of itself to the season, and she dressed accordingly in her gray silk, which was the best she had, and pinned her dark hair with the 2 pearl combs that had been her mother's, and told herself that she would stand near the east wall and be unobtrusive, and this would all be finished by 10 o'clock. The room was full of women in ivory and gold and deep rose, their gowns new, their jewels catching the candlelight from the 3 long chandeliers. Georgiana found her wall and occupied it with the stillness she had practiced, and watched the season arrange itself according to its own elaborate grammar. Miss Cecily Vane arrived on the arm of her mother, wearing a gown of pale gold that had been commissioned for this room specifically, and she had the kind of composed, deliberate beauty that comes from being told since childhood that one is the correct choice. She moved through the gathering with Lady Dorothea at her other side, and the 2 of them, young certainty and aging authority, formed a natural alliance that the room understood without being told. Edmund stood near the terrace doors. He was alone in the way that people of extreme social power are alone. Surrounded, but at a distance that no one quite had the standing to close. Georgiana noticed him because she noticed everything, because noticing was the skill her situation had refined in her over years. She noticed the precise quality of his stillness, the way he stood at the door as though considering something the rest of the room could not see. He turned. His gaze crossed the room and found her without, she thought, any navigation. As though the room presented no obstacle, as though her gray silk at the east wall was as visible to him as the gold and ivory nearer the center. She looked back, which she knew was an error, and she held the look for 1 half breath before dropping her eyes to the floor. Her pulse was at her throat. She fixed her attention on the hem of the nearest dancer's gown and told herself firmly that she had been looked at by men before, and it had meant nothing. And this was no different. and she was a servant, and nothing more. She almost believed it. The Dowager found Miss Vane at 9:30 and positioned her so that they were both within Georgiana's line of sight, whether or not within hers. "She has stayed rather longer than required," the Dowager said, in the low, precise voice of someone who has no need to raise it for effect. One understands the appeal of a warm room when one's own is considerably less so. But a governess who attends the social hours uninstructed is a governess who has misunderstood the arrangement considerably. Miss Vane glanced at Georgiana with the brief, measuring look of a woman who has been told there is no competition and is making quite certain. She said nothing. She had learned, at the Dowager's side, that silence in these moments carried more weight than agreement. Georgiana heard every word. She heard it because she was standing close enough to hear, because the east wall was closer to the alcove than she had calculated, and because the room's music had paused for the dancers to reform. She heard it, and she absorbed it, and she did not leave the room, because leaving would have been the confirmation the Dowager was looking for, and she had enough of her father's stubbornness left in her to refuse that. She looked up, once, and found that Edmund had heard it too. He was standing 15 feet away, and he was looking at her. And whatever expression a man's face carries when it is working against itself, that was what she saw before she looked away again. She left at 10 o'clock. She did not hurry. She walked back to the east wing with her hands steady at her sides and told herself that the evening had cost her nothing she had not already known how to afford. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. Edmund, in the weeks that followed, came to the schoolroom twice, both times with a stated practical purpose. Once to review the books ordered for Oliver's continued education, once to inform her that the household summer calendar would require Oliver to be available for certain afternoons when extended family visited. Both times he remained longer than the purpose required. He stood at the schoolroom window and asked questions about Oliver's progress that could have been asked in 2 exchanges, but lasted considerably more. He asked what stories she had been reading. He asked whether Oliver had mentioned his father. He asked on the second visit whether she found the east room sufficient for her needs. Quite sufficient, she told him. He looked at her steadily for a moment. "There is a larger room available on the 2nd floor of the east wing," he said, "with a proper grate. You need not stay in the smaller room if the fire there is inadequate." She thought about what it would mean to accept and what it would mean to refuse. She said carefully, "I appreciate the consideration, Your Grace, but I would not wish to impose on the household." He said, "It is not an imposition I am inviting you to impose. It is a room. Say yes." She said, "Yes," because there was no room in his sentence for anything else, and because her hands, betraying her, were warm. What she did not know then, and what the house had been protecting from general knowledge with the dedication of a thing long kept from weather, was the particular shape of the wound that had made Edmund what he was. She came to understand it not from the man himself, but from Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, who had been at Ashmore House for 22 years, and who permitted herself, on a morning when the upstairs maid was ill, and Georgiana had offered to carry the fresh linens to the upper hall, a single, careful disclosure. "He does not permit it spoken of," Mrs. Hartley said, smoothing a folded sheet against the shelf with the flat of her hand. "The late Lord Ashmore, Mr. Frederick, the Duke's younger brother." Georgiana waited. "There was a crossing," Mrs. Hartley said. "Late October, 2 years past. The Duke had arranged for Frederick to travel north to inspect a property. The road crosses the river at Helwick Bridge, and there had been rain for a fortnight, and the water was high. Edmund told him the crossing was passable. He had been at that crossing the week before. She paused. It was not passable the morning Frederick crossed it. The carriage went into the river. Frederick and the driver. Oliver was not with them. By the grace of whatever mercy remains in the world, Georgiana held the weight of it without moving. Edmund has not cried since, Mrs. Hartley said. He made the rule for himself first, I think. Before he made it for the house. He did not trust himself not to, so he made it law. He does not permit tears. Not in the servants. Not in the family. Not in the boy. She set the sheet on the shelf with the careful finality of someone who has said the thing and will not unsay it. Oliver wept for a month after his father died. Then he stopped, because the Duke was kind about it in his way, but clear. And the child took it into himself and closed around it, the way children do. Georgiana understood then why Oliver did not speak. Not because he could not, because speech, for Oliver, had been inseparable from grief, and grief had been ruled out of the house, and so the boy had found the most economical solution available to a 7-year-old. He had contracted himself to a size where grief could not find purchase. She understood also why Edmund had watched her in the garden without announcing himself. She was doing, with Oliver, the thing he had been unable to do himself, and he had not known what to do with the sight of it. She sat with that knowledge for 2 days. She sat with it and turned it in her mind and considered the options before her. She could say nothing, which would protect her position and Oliver's slow, uncertain progress, and would cost Oliver the most direct route to the thing he needed. She could speak, which would put before Edmund a truth he had specifically organized his household to avoid, and would risk everything she currently had, which was £30 per quarter and the East Wing room with the proper grate and a small life she had managed to make bearable. She chose to speak. She went to the study at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, when she knew from the household's pattern that he received Mr. Calloway on Thursdays at 10, and was therefore in his study, and therefore alone. She knocked. He said, "Come in." And she came in. And he looked up from the papers on the desk with the expression of a man whose morning had just changed shape without warning. She stood just inside the door. She said, "I need to speak to you about Oliver, Your Grace, and I would ask that you hear me completely before you respond." He set down his pen. He said, "Speak." She told him what she knew. She told him without embellishment, as clearly as she knew how, that Oliver was silent not from incapacity, but from the precise calculation of a grieving child who had understood that grief was not permitted in this house and that he had swallowed his in order to survive it. She told him that the silence was compressing, not resolving, and that what Oliver needed was not a different school of management, but a single explicit permission, that he was allowed to miss his father, and that the person most qualified to give that permission was the man sitting across the desk from her. Edmund was still for a very long time. "You understand," he said at last, "that this observation concerns a matter I did not invite your opinion on." "I do understand that," she said. "I also understand that I may lose my position for offering it. But the position is £30 per quarter, and Oliver is Oliver, and I find I cannot balance that arithmetic in the direction of silence." Something moved across his face, not anger. Something older than anger, and considerably more complicated. He said, "Go." She went. She walked back to the East Wing, and she sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap, and she told herself she had done the right thing, which she believed. And she told herself it would probably not matter, which she also believed. She thought about her father, who had done the right thing consistently and died with very little to show for it, and who had told her once that the doing was the point, not the outcome, and she pressed her hands together and decided to believe him again. What she did not hear, because she was in the east wing and the door between the study and the corridor was closed, was the sound of Edmund Ashmore sitting forward in his chair and pressing both hands flat against his desk, and breathing, slowly, through a thing he had not permitted himself to feel in 2 years. The Whitmore Ball was 3 days later. It was the largest gathering of the season, held at Whitmore Park across the county, and Georgiana attended because the Duchess's invitation had included Ashmore House generally, and Edmund had made no instruction to the contrary. And she had thought, in the fragile optimism that follows a costly truth, that perhaps she had not yet been dismissed after all. She had misjudged the landscape. Lady Dorothea had been watching. For weeks. The small accumulating signs of her son's attention, and she had drawn from them conclusions that frightened her in the particular way that threats to the social order frighten those who depend on it for their identity. Miss Vane was the correct choice. Miss Vane had £8,000, a family connection to the Earl of Dalton, and the Dowager's complete confidence. A clergyman's daughter from Devonshire in a twice-trimmed grey gown was, at best, an embarrassment, and, at worst, a catastrophe. And Lady Dorothea had decided, somewhere in the fortnight between the Ashmore Ball and the Whitmore Ball, that embarrassments left unaddressed became catastrophes without warning. She waited until the third set, when the room was at its most populated and the candles were at their highest, and the Whitmore ballroom held, Georgiana estimated, somewhere near 200 people. She walked toward Georgiana from across the room with Miss Vane beside her and 2 of the senior ladies of the county at her left, and she stopped in a position that the room's arrangement made quite public. "Miss Stewart," she said for the room, "I wonder whether you might explain to Lady Whitmore how it comes about that a servant engaged for the care of a child presents herself, uninstructed, at a gathering of this nature." Lady Whitmore, a well-meaning woman of 55, who had not known she was to be deployed in this way, looked startled. The nearest couples stopped. The music, as though in agreement with the Dowager's sense of theater, paused between figures. "A companion and reader to Master Ashmore," the Dowager continued, in the bright, level voice of someone performing clarification, "is a servant. A servant does not attend the season's gatherings. A servant does not require the same invitations as the family. A servant, above all, does not permit herself to form attachments within the household that exceed her station, or to offer, uninvited, opinions on matters of family governance." The room understood. It always understood. That was the room's particular skill, absorbing the hierarchical information in a social moment and aligning itself to it within 4 breaths. Georgiana felt the color leave her face. She felt it leave not in the heated rush of shame, but in the cold, deliberate way of someone standing in a draft, the warmth simply departing. She was aware of 200 faces arranging themselves toward her, of Miss Vane's composure, of Lady Dorothea's satisfaction, contained and precise, moving behind her eyes. She did not look for Edmund. She had learned not to look for anyone to rescue her. She was wrong about that, too. There was a movement at the far side of the room, a directional shift in the crowd, the way a current changes in water when something large moves against it. Heads turned, first those nearest the disturbance, then in a spreading wave toward the room's center, and then even the musicians, who had raised their bows for the next figure, lowered them again. Edmund Ashmore was crossing the ballroom floor. He was crossing it with the absolute deliberation of a man who has decided a thing and found no argument against the decision sufficient. He was 31 years old, and he wore the authority of his rank not as decoration, but as fact. And the 200 people in the room understood, from the quality of that crossing, that something was happening that had not been scheduled for the evening. Mr. Calloway moved from the side of the room in his wake, which meant this had been considered, and the considering had included the procedural dimensions. Edmund stopped in front of Georgiana. He was close enough that she could see the exact quality of his stillness, and that it was not the disciplined stillness of a man containing himself, but the settled stillness of a man who had finally stopped arguing with himself and found it peaceful. She looked up at him. Her hands were cold. Her breathing had become a matter requiring conscious management. He said, to the room, in the level, clear voice that required no amplification, "Miss Stewart is not a servant in my household." The room did not breathe. "She has been treated as one," he said, "and that is a failure of my governance, not a fact about her character or her worth. She is a woman of considerable intelligence, genuine courage, and the kind of honesty that most households conspire to eliminate as quickly as possible. She is also the reason my ward has spoken more words in the last 6 weeks than in the preceding 11 months. He paused. "I have asked Mr. Calloway to draw the settlement papers this morning. Miss Stewart has not yet been asked and has not yet agreed, which I am aware is a departure from the traditional sequence of events." A sound went through the room that was not quite laughter and was not quite shock, but was something between them, a collective exhale of surprise acknowledging the break in protocol. He turned from the room to Georgiana. "Georgiana," he said. "Her name. Not Miss Stewart. Her name." Precisely as though it belonged in his mouth and had been waiting there. "You told me the truth about Oliver, when it would have been considerably safer not to. I have been looking for a person who would do that for a great deal longer than I have acknowledged, even to myself." He stopped. Started again, because Edmund Ashmore, who spoke rarely, was speaking now from a place where careful sentences came harder than authority ever had. "I am not asking you to solve the problem of this house. I am asking whether you might be willing to live in it properly, as its mistress, as my wife." Georgiana was aware of several things simultaneously. She was aware of the room, pressing at the edges of her vision. She was aware of Lady Dorothea, very still to her left, and of the thought behind her eyes that was something like, she had not anticipated this precisely, though she had feared something like it, which was the closest the Dowager had come in many years to understanding that her confidence had been misplaced. She was aware of Miss Vane, who had taken one small step backward, and whose composure had not broken, but had become suddenly the composure of someone holding something very carefully, rather than of someone who had never needed to hold anything at all. She was aware, most of all, of the thing that had arrived in her throat, which was not grief exactly, though it was related to grief, and was not joy exactly, though it was related to joy, but was the specific sensation of a person being told that the verdict they had accepted for themselves was not the final verdict, and that someone had gone to the trouble of overturning it in public, in front of all the people who had delivered it, which was more than she had thought to want, and more than she had thought to receive. Her eyes were wet. She could not prevent it. The warmth of it moved to the surface, and she felt the first tear reach her cheek. And she thought, distantly, that she was crying in Ashmore's house, and that he had a rule about that, and that she was quite unable to be sorry. He reached up and took that tear from her cheek with the side of his thumb, in front of 200 people, in perfect silence. He had never done that before. Not for anyone. The rule had been his own first, before it was the house's, and he had kept it for 2 years as the only form of discipline he trusted, and he was breaking it now, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what he was breaking, and the choosing of it moved through him with the clarity of something long overdue. His hand was steady. "Yes," she said, because there was only one word, and she was done with every other answer. Mr. Calloway confirmed to the room and to Lady Whitmore and to the assembled season that the Duke of Ashmore had engaged him to draw a marriage settlement that morning, which provided the procedural confirmation the room required to understand that what had just occurred was irrevocable. He was a man accustomed to legal facts, and he stated this one without embellishment. And that was enough. Lady Dorothea was silent. Georgiana looked at her once and saw in the older woman's face not the satisfied malice of the evening's opening, but something quieter and considerably more complicated. The expression of a person who has been proved wrong about something important and has enough intelligence to know it, even if she would not, for some time yet, have the language to say so. The music resumed. The season continued, as it always did, arranging itself around the new fact. By November, the snow had come early to Ashmore Park, and it lay across the gardens in the particular silence that snow produces, which is not the absence of sound, but its transformation into something softer. The household had settled into a new arrangement, which was both nothing like the old one and somehow more itself, as though the house had been waiting for permission to be what it had always been capable of being. Oliver was in the drawing room when Georgiana came down from changing for the evening, which was not the east wing room with the view of the stable yard, but the rooms that had been hers since September, with the wide windows and the fire that Mrs. Hartley stoked without being asked. Oliver was sitting at the piano bench, not playing, only looking at the keys with the thoughtful expression of a 7-year-old considering whether to begin something. He looked up when she came in and said, quite clearly, "Will you play? Edmund says you play well." She said, "Edmund flatters me." But she sat down beside him and played, and he leaned his small shoulder against her arm and listened. Edmund came in 20 minutes later and stood in the doorway with the particular quality of stillness she had learned to read, which was not the stillness of a man containing himself, but the stillness of a man watching something that it would be a loss to interrupt. He had spoken to Oliver 2 weeks after the Whitmore ball, in the direct way she had asked him to, sitting with the boy in the garden for an afternoon and permitting, for the first time, the name Frederick to be said aloud without being moved away from. Oliver had wept a little. Edmund had permitted it. The space that opened in the boy afterward was not empty, but inhabited, populated by the small, ordinary vitality that had been compressed out of him by the weight of unacknowledged sorrow. The fire moved in the grate. Outside the long windows, snow continued to fall on the pale gravel of the courtyard, covering the raked paths in white, making the garden new. Edmund came away from the doorway and sat in the chair nearest the piano. And Oliver looked at him with the gray eyes they shared and said something about whether wolves were afraid in winter, which was a question clearly sourced in the Birds volume's companion on northern animals. And Edmund said that he believed most things capable of fear were also capable of endurance, and that the two were not separate qualities, but the same one. Oliver considered this for a moment, and then nodded, satisfied, and asked Georgiana to play the piece she had played before. She played it again. Edmund watched her hands on the keys and said nothing, which was the form his tenderness most often took, and she had learned to receive it in the spirit in which it was given. Later, when Oliver had been taken up to bed by Mrs. Hartley and the fire had been built higher against the deepening cold, Georgiana and Edmund sat in the drawing room with the snow pressing softly against the windows, and the piano stood behind them with its lid raised and the final chord still present in the air. And she thought of her father, who had left her nothing but a careful education and the instruction to keep going. And she thought he had left her more than he knew. Edmund had said very little since Oliver's departure. He was a man who held the things that mattered to him in the precise way one holds a candle against wind, with the hand curved to protect rather than to grip. He turned presently and looked at her with the directness that still caught her mid-breath every time she encountered it. He said very quietly, "I owe you something I do not know how to repay." She said, "You wiped my tears in front of 200 people." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the nearest thing she had seen to a smile from him in all the months of the house, and it opened in his face slowly, like something that had been waiting for the proper season. "A singular sacrifice," he said, "for a man of my rules." She laughed. It was a small sound, and it filled the drawing room, and it moved through the house the way warm air moves through a cold space, finding the corners and occupying them. The snow fell. The fire held. Oliver's voice came down the staircase once, briefly, asking Mrs. Hartley a question about mourning, and the answer that came back was gentle. And then the house was quiet again, with the specific quiet of a place that has finally organized itself correctly. Georgiana was home. Not a room sufficient for her needs. Not a position for £30 per quarter. Not the east wing. Not the back of any drawing room. Not the edge of any ballroom where she stood and took up as little space as possible and told herself it was enough. Was this room, with this fire, with that snow, with the sound of his breathing even and unhurried beside her, and somewhere above them, a boy who had remembered how to speak. She was home. If Georgiana's story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment you felt it most. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, and every comment reminds us you are there.